Ladies and gentlemen, some very impressive benchmarks for Intel's Arrow Lake processors have emerged online. In fact, there are two different SKUs, the 245 as well as the 265. And what we are looking at here is, despite the fact that these are engineering sample processors, very impressive results both against their predecessor as well as various AMD CPUs. And we also are going to be tackling in this very video some updates for AMD's release schedule of products, including perhaps most excitingly the Strix Point Halo, also known as Sarlacc CPUs. And we're going to get into that plus more after this quick message from the sponsor of the video. If you're running a copy of Windows 10 which isn't activated, of course, not only do you have to worry about the missing customization options, but there's also that annoying Windows desktop watermark reminding you to activate. Today's video is sponsored by WhoKeys.com, and they have an excellent price on Windows 10 Professional as well as home keys. Yeah, and they also of course sell games. I've bought a few Windows 10 keys with my own personal account to test everything was legit and worked in preparation for this sponsored video. You can pick up one of their keys for 25% off using the coupon code RGT in the checkout. There's links to their website in the video description. Also, if you're building a few systems, there's bundles available too. Again, you can check out WhoKeys.com and use the coupon code RGT for 25% off the listed Windows 10 key prices. So let's begin then with the 265 benchmark, then we'll look at the 245. Now, I know I do sound like a broken record, but I really want to stress that these are still engineering sample results. So therefore, not only do you have the factor of the CPU itself maybe not boosting or maintaining such high clock frequencies as the retail variant, but of course, there could be something hinky with the microcode of the CPU. Just the BIOS in general could not be behaving well. You get the idea. Basically, things can and probably will improve by some measure. How much? I mean, it's not like it's going to double in performance, let's be realistic. But again, there is certainly some room left in the tank for Intel to squeeze and tweak things for final release. So let's begin with the 265. Now, the 265 is a 20-thread processor, and that is 8/12. Now, remember, there is no hyperthreading in the performance cores here for the 265, or indeed any of the Arrow Lake processors. And basically, in a Geekbench result, this is Geekbench 6, we are looking at 3200 for the single thread, and the multi-core score is just over 19,400. WCCF Tech have actually done a pretty nice job actually comparing this against other CPUs. So in terms of single thread, the 9950X scores around 3360. By the way, just for everyone's sanity, i.e. my own, I'm going to round up and down the scores as necessary. And if we compare this against one of Intel's processors, namely we'll pick on the, let's pick on the 4900K, as that sounds like a good example. It's basically on par with that, it's slightly lower, but again, that is going to depend, of course, on the various configuration of the CPU you're running. Even things like, of course, memory speeds as well are going to make a really big difference. Now, let's compare the 265 versus, let's say, the 14900K in multi-core. So the multi-core score is around 22,000 that WCCF Tech here have, and around 20,500, again in Geekbench, for the 9950X. Meanwhile, the 265KF is scoring 19,433. Now remember, this is not the highest end configuration of this line of CPUs. That would be the 285, and in the case of the 285, we're probably going to see slightly higher single thread performance in terms of, high clock frequencies, but also you have those additional 4 E-cores, and it seems that the E-cores of Arrow Lake are actually perhaps the most impressive part of these CPUs. So I do think in terms of multi-threading, Intel really are going to be holding down the fort. I think it's going to be really impressive. It's too early yet to know how, in terms of gaming, it's going to compare against the previous generation. Obviously, if you have something like a 13700K or equivalent, you may not want to upgrade anyway, because it's, it's not like gaming, typically speaking, is going to have a massive performance uplift. I say that, but maybe if you have an RTX 5090 in some titles, maybe, who knows. But generally speaking, this is still a very impressive result. Now let's move on to the 245. Now, just as a quick note, we are looking at a 6+8 configuration here. So the performance cores are 6 and the 8 cores are for the energy efficient cores, or the E cores, or whatever you want to call them. In terms of the single core results, this is unfortunately a different benchmark. This is actually Geekbench 5. We're looking at 2250. Again, I'm going to round up and down the scores, whereas the multi-core score is 13,350. Now, to put this into some context against the previous generation parts, we actually have the 14900K, which is scoring 2400 points, and just a shade under 27,000 for the multi-thread. We also have a previously leaked 285, which was 2455 and 27,300 for the single and multi-thread score respectively. So actually, roughly speaking, the previous score of the 285 is higher. However, most likely it seems that this is a higher wattage processor, so that does make sense. And obviously the multi-thread score is considerably higher, again around 18,300 versus the 285, which is 27,400 essentially. I want to give credit to WCCF Tech again for their nice graphs in terms of just making it quite easy for a visual layout. I'm going to be absolutely fascinated to see how Arrow Lake actually performs versus Zen 5 once things kind of finalize. The Ryzen 9000 CPUs are just kind of all over the place at the moment. I'm really not 100% certain what to make of them. It's like the IPC gains do genuinely seem to be very impressive in certain applications. Now, of course, Turing and other processors are going to be releasing over the next several months, and of course AMD are going to be putting out BIOS updates. There's something else quite interesting as well. Reviewers have basically been given an update from AMD that TLDR essentially says that if you had not performed a clean operating system installation, so let's say you had a 9700X, which, you know, a lot of people had already reviewed, and then you went to the 9950X, there could have been something hinky where basically it was just something the way the core scheduling was behaving, and therefore you would get lower performance results. And it's going to be very interesting to see what happens. It seems that the IOD is really holding back the Ryzen 9000 series performance, plus some other stuff. I will be absolutely fascinated to see how the X3D parts perform in the Ryzen 9000 lineup. At the end of the day, however, it's still not the same thing as just simply having considerably more memory bandwidth available. So I will be absolutely fascinated to see how well Turing and Turing Dense and other parts like the Sarlacc, Strix Point Halo perform. Speaking of which, let's move on to AMD release dates. So a Twitter user by the name of Huang An Fo, hopefully I've pronounced that correctly. If not, I really apologize. I do follow this account. They're a pretty good leaker. They've had a pretty good track record. And essentially on the 10th of October, we're going to see Strix Pro, Turing, that's classic and dense, as well as MI325X and some Linux products, which may or may not interest you, depending on, well, your interests. And at CES 2025, Strix Halo as well as Kraken will be announced. Now, at that same event, I've been hearing RDNA 4 is going to be announced, but unfortunately that information is a little bit old. I did ask on Twitter whether, this was the case, and unfortunately, at this point, they still are not certain whether that's going to be happening or not. Personally, I think it probably is. There is a separate, unrelated story to this that basically AIBs have started to wind down the production for RDNA-free GPUs. But that doesn't mean that we're going to see RDNA-4 launching this year, because obviously, even if you had those AIBs just cut production right this second, or even, to be honest, several weeks ago, there are still, of course, cards that are sitting in warehouses and on retailer shelves, and quite frankly, some of the parts have just not sold particularly well. That's one of the reasons, of course, we've seen game bundles with the N32 parts. So it's going to be very interesting, quite frankly, to see how RDNA 4 fares. It's going to somewhat depend, of course, on, well, what NVIDIA are doing. Now, the rumor is RDNA 4 is going to be roughly between the 7900 XT as well as XTX. In performance, I've heard it's closer to the XTX, but unfortunately, when it comes to benchmarks, how is that being tested? I.e., is it multiple different games at, let's say, 4K? Is it multiple different games at 1440p? Is it the average of multiple different games across different resolutions, and you're just saying, well, generally it performed X performance? Or is it one benchmark, for example, Time Spy, and that's all we have to go on? Now, we'll have to wait, of course, because unfortunately that's not 100% clear. The ray tracing performance is rumored to be significantly better on RDNA 4, but really and truly, let's say it is closer to the 7900 XT for sake of this video. Let's, err on the side of caution. That isn't necessarily a bad thing as long as the pricing is in place. And ultimately, that's going to be kind of the big deciding factor. The rumor I was hearing quite early on is AMD wanted to price these to be extremely aggressive. Unfortunately, there are some stuff which is somewhat outside of AMD's control, not least of which, obviously, TSMC are going whoop with their prices, and memory prices are also forecast to be going up as well. Well, we'll have to wait, unfortunately, and that seems to be the common theme, unfortunately, of this video. We're somewhat in a holding pattern. My personal opinion in terms of CPU upgrades remains pretty much what I've said in multiple videos at this point. Don't buy anything unless you absolutely have to. Wait for the X3D variants to launch for the Ryzen 9000 series, as well as, of course, Intel's Arrow Lake. Maybe wait a month or two to see how motherboards kind of shape up, what the best version is, BIOSes, that type of situation. And then maybe, let's say hypothetically, everything launches by, let's just hypothetically say November. By early next year, you're going to have a pretty good indicator of what the best memory is for performance, what the best CPU is for your specific needs, what the best motherboard is, and so on and so forth. With that said, guys, take care of yourselves, have an amazing day. Bye for now.